Welcome everyone to this virtual conversation about the life and work of Kenneth White. Very pleased that so many of you could join us for this. As Dave has said, it's a sad occasion, but on the other hand, as I'm about to say, although he's a great loss to Scotland, France and the world, his work and vision will live on. And we have sent our deepest sympathies to his wife, Marie Claude. Kenneth White died peacefully at his home in Traberdin on the north coast of Brittany on the 11th of August this year at the age of 87 after a short illness. He's widely regarded as Scotland's most brilliant mind of the second half of the 20th century and was, as the Herald obituary headline said, a visionary founder of the international Geopoetics movement. He was also a wonderful poet whom we are celebrating here on National Poetry Day. It was as an inspirational speaker and reader of his work that I first met him when I was a young man searching for the meaning of life. I didn't find it for obvious reasons, but what I did find was someone with a zest for life who opened up countless cultural possibilities for me and many others at that time. This was back in 1963, when fortunately for me, he was my tutor in French in my first year at the University of Glasgow, and he had just started as a lecturer there. He set up the jargon group out with the university system and gave amazing talks on such subjects as autopsy of the modern, Friedrich Nietzsche, Walt Whitman, Taoism, Poetry and Revolution 1917, D.H. Lawrence, the Beat Poets of America, Henry Thoreau, and more. He opened my mind to all of these great writers and thinkers and made me want to read them for myself. I still have a copy of Walt Whitman's collected poems. I just don't know if you can see that there. And it's also got some prose in it, which is dated August 1964. Must have saved up as a student to buy that tome on the advice of Kenneth White. And I also have, a bit earlier than that, I've got a copy of Wild Coal. I don't know if you can see the front cover there. Yeah, Wild Coal, which was his first ever published book, his poetry collection. And I'm pleased to say that I got this, I dated this November 1963, and he's dedicated it in here and says, "The first steps on a long road with my friendship, Ken." So he was, however, a lot more than just literature or being a writer. I just had something jumped in there. Give me a second. Yeah, that's it. This quotation is from Jargon Paper number 1, which he wrote at the time. I'll just quote it. "It's the animation to life with which we are concerned, and with those more than literary books that pull the doors of the mind off their hinges, releasing the spirit. It is not for nothing, i.e. because they have, quote, artistic leanings, that the Taoist and Zen masters who arrived at nature, cosmos, chaos, are also poets. It is because they are men alive and exulting in their aliveness." Now, this exultation in aliveness is what he taught us then and continued to do so for another 60 years. Those feelings of what Coleridge called joyance, engendered by his talks, were continued in discussions late into the night at the flat in Hamilton Drive in Glasgow's West End, where he and his wife Marie Claude lived. We also went walking with him across the moors to the council house in Fairley on the Ayrshire coast, where he grew up and walked, and we met his mother and his his sister in that house. And we also had another weekend walking on the Isle of Arran, and when we read our poems to each other. On a personal level, my study of philosophy had led me to grapple with the question of whether ideas change the world, or whether you first need to change the world in order to change people's ideas. Quite a conundrum, that one. And he told me to read Georgy Plekhanov's The Monist View of History. And sure enough, it had the answer, which was the class struggle and the socialist revolution. That set me off down the political road I've travelled ever since. And in 1967, he and I agreed to go our separate ways. He moved to France to continue his work of advancing what he proposed as a cultural revolution. And I stayed here to try to build a socialist future in the city and in Scotland. I lost touch with him for 20 years, but I always had an itch to reconnect with him. And in 1987, I came across an article by him on Zen and the Birds of Kentigern in the magazine Cencrastus. Inside the back cover, it said, Kenneth White is professor of poetry at the University of Paris, Sorbonne. I went there to see him at the Sorbonne that summer, but he was in Brittany, where I eventually tracked him down and received a warm welcome. When he founded the International Institute of Geopoetics in 1989, and his books began to be published again by mainstream publishing in Scotland that year, I set up the Open World Poetics Group to invite a range of speakers to discuss all kinds of subjects, spend weekends away in the country, and give poetry readings, just like the Jargon Group. Later, I helped the accomplished writer, musician, and educator Tony McManus to set up the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics in 1995. Now, that takes us to the 1990s and my experience of Kenneth White, and I'm now going to pass over to Mark to take up the story from there and share with us his memories of Kenneth White. I'm just going to admit more folk who have been waiting patiently.
Just get permission from the chair, Dave, to say a few words.
Yes, please do, Mark, carry on.
Yeah, 1995-96 was the time when I first got to know Kenneth. At the time from 1994, Ian Anderson, the broadcaster, and I were running a cultural programme alongside Celtic Connections in January of each year. The festival started in 1993, and we started a cultural programme alongside the music, and we had some musicians talking. Dave spoke at least once or twice. Norrie visited and spoke with us in the 2000s and maybe in the late 90s. But Kenneth and people like Edna O'Brien, John Purser, Richard Arco, a wide range of literary figures, poets, musicians, politicians, thinkers, cultural icons, if you like. I was just looking back at some of the programmes over 15 years, and it was quite remarkable, really. So Kenneth, it was about the same time as the centre was set up, because Ian Anderson was the kind of programmer, if you like. He and I worked together at Strathclyde, and he would and I would work on what's the following year's programme going to be. And Kenneth joined us, and it was a real eye-opener for me, and an ear-opener and a mind-opener, as were many of our guests and the discussions. And one of the contributions Kenneth made, I think, was the breadth of cultural discourse that then Ian and I enabled for 15 years with Celtic Connections. I think back on his contribution, and it was Ian that identified that as a means of a catalyst for us to think differently. Now, thinking differently that way takes a long time, and it's not just about a road to Damascus. It really is about assimilation and synthesis of thoughts and so on as you're busy at universities and teaching and research and so on. But I think it's interesting that Norrie and Ken met first at university. And of course, university is a place to ask difficult questions, and that's what Ken was doing right away. And his challenge to the norm or the canon, I think, is really important to consider that. Even if you look, I love the little tribute that our friends in AIR have there with their emails and the books behind. I gathered the books round about before. I think someone's not muted anyway. If you think of the titles of his books, the Open World, obviously, The Wanderer's Charts, Grounding a World, Across the Territories, Travels in the Drifting Dawn. These are statements in themselves in intent. And the whole idea of the way books, groundedness, thinking differently, the journey from Brittany and Galicia and Asturias, the Celtic way, if you like, that really influenced my thinking in terms of as a composer and a writer and so on. To the extent that I introduced geopoetics concepts in Norrie's work and others to university students, particularly at the University of the Highlands and Islands, with a course I started, Music and the Environment, a master's course. And in fact, we took some of the students to Seal and we had haiku walks and so on and so forth. And it was a really important dimension. We brought musicians and other artists to the table. And we've yet to do more with music and geopoetics. Dave and I had a conversation that maybe 2 years ago, can't remember, about that, and the need for us to critique more, to think more, to bring more into it. And of course, the issue working with master students is that they come, do the course, and then they move on. But it certainly was a big influence on them. I would introduce them to the literature with Norrie right at the beginning of the course. And their course was a creative journey, as it were. And right at the outset, we began with looking at Ken's work, as well as Norrie's poetry, which was really important. There's a number of areas within his literature that one could quote and recount. When Dave and I spoke a couple of years ago, we talked about Walden, we talked about Ken's writing about John Cage and so on and so forth. What I think is most telling for me is from the conversations in Coast to Coast with Norrie in particular, but also with Tony McManus from the Centred Complex. And Ken often uses musical language in description of his thinking. And in this exchange, Tony's pushing him about the geo bit in literary text and the commentary about where is the geo in some of the conversations and some of the things that have been written. And he says, as part of the response, geopoetics gives a grounding. You can find more elements of geopoetics in the sciences than you can find in most literature, poetry included, but not composed. He starts using musical language. Poetics is concerned with the composition of a world. That's my world. Several types of expression can come into play. There's the fundamental field, but there can be also impressionistic, that's both art and music, expressionistic, you can think of composers and artists, conceptualistic, methodological approach to it. What counts ultimately is the orchestration, a kind of world music. And I think that's beautiful. And it resonated with me as a composer. I'm actually working on symphonic work at the moment. I'm doing another version of Dreaming Agricas, but when we did the Expressing the Earth and Seal, there was a version of it there, and I've expanded that, and I'll hopefully get a performance at the festival next year. But it really embodied a different way of thinking for me, and I owe him a great deal that the legacy has left us. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say in the introduction. I'd be delighted to hear other people's perspectives. Thanks for letting me talk.
Thanks, Mark. Norrie, are you all right to load up the?
Yeah, I'm working on it. Here we go. Give me a minute or two. Yeah, so I'm loading it up. Yeah.
Well, maybe while you're doing that, I'll just make a couple of remarks.
Sure.
For me, I'd never heard of Kenneth White at all until the mid-90s, and I think I'd read a review of on Scottish Ground in the Scotsman. It must have been by Catherine Lockerbie, who was the literary editor of the Scotsman at the time and a great champion of Kenneth White's. And to be honest, I couldn't make head nor tail of it. I just could not grasp what it was on about at all. But then Catherine, when she was director of Edinburgh Book Festival, she invited him to do the big sort of keynote lecture at the book festival in 2001. And it was at that, having heard that lecture, that it all started to make sense. And there was one passage in particular in that lecture, which fortunately was published afterwards, when he said, it's from the nature of things that real writing emerges, not from any I-thou dialectic. Outside the dialectics, something else takes over. Contact between subject and object in a context of non-separation. What emerges from that contact is the beautiful thing. And I thought here was a different kind of aesthetic. It was a challenge to take on a different kind of aesthetics. And as a musician, as a folk musician, a traditional musician, there was a real challenge there to think about the kind of music that I was into and that practiced in a different kind of a way, so that it wasn't just what I mean, he was a great phrase maker, Kenneth White. And he talked in one of his interviews with you, Norrie, about folk music, traditional music. It was all very well, but it was mostly just what he called ceilidhs of commemoration. So the challenge was to make it more than just ceilidhs of commemoration. And I think if there's one phrase that really sums up, packs geopoetics for me into one short phrase, it's not his own phrase, but a phrase that he loved to quote, which is, "A cold wind blows in Islay." And I think there's so much in that. Are you ready?
Yep. Ready.
Okay. Here we go.
Here we come. Just coming up.
Hello, Norrie. Hello, Mark. And hello, everyone.
These poems are selected from
I would have liked to join you for this trip.
longer poems. Scotia Deserta.
Ah, where's that come from?
All those piles, lofts, and stands. And the gulls at large pier, sitting in that cafe at the big window full of wind and light, reading and watching, thinking back to the ice, watching it move from the high middle spine out into the Atlantic, feeling it gouge out lochs and sculpt cracks. Europe in the fall.
It's
After surveying
can I ask folk if they've got their mics open to close them?
Yeah.
Or I think you could do it, Norrie, from where you are.
Right, I'll try. It's that Kenneth White just emerged from the ether there for us all, which is an interesting phenomenon. But here's Regis Poulet, president of the International Institute of Geopoetics. I hope we'll get him this time.
Hello, Norrie. Hello, Mark. And hello, everyone. I would have liked to join you for this tribute to Kenneth White. I hope that this little video contribution will nevertheless arouse your interest. I thank Norman Bissell, a particularly dynamic Geopoetics Center director, for his initiative and for accepting my contribution in this form. Talking about Kenneth with you tonight is symbolic. Through his career, commitment and work, Kenneth has highlighted the links between Scotland and France. He liked to recall the eminent role of Scottish scholars in the Middle Ages in the Carolingian and therefore European Renaissance, as he regularly evoked the double Franco-Scottish nationality systematically granted to the citizens of both countries for a long time. Of course, he did this to emphasize the friendship between peoples despite the vagaries of history. But there were strategic considerations in the field of thought and culture beyond the intense personal implications. The first example of intellectual nomadism, according to which it is a question of taking from one culture what is lacking in another one in order to open up a richer and more intense cultural field, applied to the French spirit and the Scottish spirit. It's in the nomad mind that he writes that the Celtic spirit is the most oriental, in that it's sensitive to passages, it's a spirit that remained open to complexity of the natural world, to the cosmos, as Kenneth called it, and refused to be locked into systems. For his part, the French spirit is characterized for Kenneth by his quest for precision and clarity, the reason why he preferred French for the writing of his essays, if only in homage to Montaigne. But his precision and clarity can lead to wrath. It is necessary to associate it with a lively sensitivity and open to direct intuitions. Of course, these are broad lines, and one finds in the Scottish cultural field spirits in search of precisions and claritas, just as one finds in French culture spirits reticent to categories and systems. What I wanted to emphasize is that the Franco-Scottish couple was the crucible of intellectual nomadism and then of geopoetics. We all know, because he has stated very clearly and repeatedly, that his years of learning the world on the west coast of Scotland were decisive in his journey. Kenneth is Scottish by origin, undeniably. He crossed the Celtic Sea many times to extend his mind and his action on the continent, as one would extend a bow between two worlds in order to aim further. He settled in France and he chose Brittany, partly because it's the promontory of France, which is the promontory of Europe, which is the promontory of Asia. He chose Brittany not as a second homeland, but for strategic reasons in particular. And once settled in Brittany, he took care to explain, while loving the region and the place, that it was not there as a Celt, even though, of course, he was Celtic. Against localism, the open place. I quote, "The origin is everywhere present. It's a field of forces and forms," writes Kenneth in an essay. Kenneth was from Scotland, from France, and not only from all the places where he passed, but from all the places where he could have been, including those of thought. It's in this that is universal while being anchored in very precise places, that is intensely present while being absent. The places of his thought are, of course, his work, of which much remains to be discovered and understood, but also some physical places where his wandering became residence. Through these particular links that Kenneth created between the concrete and the abstract, we are simple readers, isolatos, or geopoetic groups, bearers after him and with him of a world. The urgency has never been greater, but in our times of confusion and short-term impulses, it's just as urgent to take the time to make the right decisions. I have no doubt that people from Scotland and France and from all over the world will explore the paths of the highest geopoetics and make it thrive. I thank you for your attention. I wish you pleasant exchanges, and I greet you friendly.
Thanks to Regis for those comments. So we're going to throw it open to the floor now. One of the things that intrigued me from what Regis was saying there was, I think, probably one of the best sort of thumbnail definitions of intellectual nomadism that I've heard. Actually, he said it's about taking what is lacking in one culture and applying ideas from another. I was just wondering if anybody had any thoughts on that, or anything else for that matter. Just stick your hand up, or the little symbol, and we'll take you in an orderly fashion. There's Tim.
Okay, Dave. Thank you for that. I hope we couldn't quite hear that terribly well. If we could have that text sometime, it'd be wonderful. There were some real gems in there, and I think one of the gems I noticed in there was what the issue you just raised. That I wanted to know why Kenneth thought that the culture or the civilization in France was better than in Scotland. I've never read the reason for that. It's often stated. So there we have some gems. Yes, I totally agree with that. It's applying, I love the whole concept of Brittany being the point of Asia. The Asian cultures do look at things differently, and obviously that's throughout his work. So I think you've nailed it on the head there, Dave, and I hope we can get a script from that talk. We were asked to put our personal meetings with Ken into the chat line. Right at the top of the chat line, I put one. I used to meet Kenneth every year at the book festivals, usually in the book signing tent, and we would always discuss whether it was geopoetics or ecopoetics. Of course, he won the argument, but he allowed me to consider the geo to come from geography, which is the living and the rocks, rather than just geology. Ecology, of course, is a word these days that is very well known and understood. It comes from the Greek for oikos, the home, and includes the living matter and the non-living matter, i.e. the subsurface, the ground. But I just wanted to point that out. I used to meet him every year, and I can't believe that his wonderful talks in the book festival were only 8 years. I used to think it went on for longer than that. They were the highlight of the intellectual year in Edinburgh, and I mourned their passing when Catherine Lockerbie moved on. Anyway, enough from me. Many thanks.
Yes, I certainly agree with that last comment there. It was not something that subsequent directors saw fit to continue, unfortunately. Can I just repeat the plea? If you have your mic open, could you close it, please? Could you mute yourself? Because there's a wee bit of background popping and crackling, which, yeah. Anyone else? Who's next? I'll maybe just pick on somebody. Yeah, it's Alistair McIntosh. Let's hear from you.
Hi, Dave. Nice to see you. Just picking up on what Tim was saying, if I heard it correctly, my hearing is not great, but if I picked it up correctly, he said that he'd had a discussion with Ken about whether it should be geo or eco poetics. And it reminds me of perhaps my last email correspondence with Kenneth after he had been over in Scotland for that Glasgow University event. How long ago was that, Nori, that event? Was it a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, something?
Yeah, pre-pandemic.
Yeah, the big conference that was in Glasgow University around his work.
2018, Alistair.
Thank you very much. Longer than I thought, my goodness. But I raised with him a specific issue, which is that Kenneth White was the patron of the Galgale Trust, and I'll need to be heading off just after 6:30 because we've got a community meal there, so forgive me if I leave prematurely. But he was the patron of the Galgale Trust here in Govan. He had, so we had him round at the Galgale on that occasion. He was also influential in the early days of the Isle of Egg Trust with the land reform. And he allowed us to use one of his poems, My Properties, in the Isle of Egg Trust manifesto, with which we launched the idea of community ownership on egg. And I raised with him this question, that in the version that we have in the Trust manifesto, My Properties runs, if I can remember it rightly from memory, I am a landowner too, after all. I have 20 acres of white silence up the back of my mind. And the reason I raised it with him is that I noticed when I was checking on the punctuation for quoting it somewhere, because he was always very particular about getting the punctuation right. He was always very generous in my experience in granting permission to use his poems, but he'd always be very insistent. You got the what they call a concrete poetry, that the exact layout of how he had the words and the page right. And I was checking it, and I noticed that in the published edition, it said, I am a landowner too, after all. I have 20 acres up the back of my skull. And I said, which is it, Ken? Is it mind or is it skull? And he said, well, it used to be mind. But then I looked at it and I thought, you know, skull is much more visceral. And taking what Tim was saying, visceral wasn't actually the word he used. That's a word I've just put into his mouth from my memory, but that's what he was getting at. Much more gritty, much more grounded, much more geo, if you like. And picking up what Tim was saying, ecology from oikos, meaning the home, was not so much his forte, but geo of the earth very much was his forte. And I see that reflected in that discussion we had, where he says it had been mind, i.e. a very homed human construct, but then he decided he really wanted it to be skull.
Yeah, and I'm reminded, you know, in that eco-geo backwards and forwards, that I gather that I read somewhere that the original notion that became geopoetics was originally going to be biocosmopoetics, which puts another slant on it again. That idea of connecting the body, the mind, and the universe, and of course, the geo, the earth, the little part that we're standing on, is our bit of the universe. Anyone else care to come in? There's a wee comment from Leanne and Nigel in the chat there, agreeing that the talks at the Edinburgh Book Festival are much missed, and their first contact was at the Institut Français d'Écosse in the 1990s. Interested, I'd hoped that he would speak at the Boswell Book Festival in Ayrshire, but that didn't happen.
Could we hear from some of the women what they think of Kenneth White and their encounters with him and their reading of his work? Any comments? It's been all men so far, I've noticed. So that's pretty unusual in most of the things that we've been doing here in Ling. It's all been women who've taken part.
I didn't know that.
No.
I'll maybe just pick on somebody again.
I would be happy to, because to me it was about bravery and about I'm not able to really say. It was very much part of where my feet are on the ground, but also he made me much braver, if that makes some sort of sense. It was the way books, the walking, the interconnectedness of people. I cannot believe that he isn't still with us, but he obviously always will be. Sorry. And yeah, he was going to talk with Gordon Turnbull at Boswell Book Festival. We hoped about Corsica. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Alison Hallett, do you want to chime in at all?
I was so hoping you wouldn't ask me. I'm on a writing residency at the moment, and my head is buried in meteorites and trees. Maybe that's quite appropriate. I suppose his writing, I don't know, chimes with a lot of my interests, and just hearing that discussion there about, you know, the difference between mind and skull, which word he's going to use, which is more grounding, is, I don't know, it's so important. So I suppose his writing has expanded my world and challenges it and continues to challenge it. Yeah, and I loved that quote as well. The origin is everywhere present. So it's thinking beyond the paradigms that still crop up all the time. It's like he's building 1,000 bridges and then inviting me to walk or run over them and meet him on the other side.
Nice, thank you. And sorry to interrupt the flow of your retreat, but thanks for that contribution anyway. Nick, Mizzelli, anything you would like to come in with?
Well, I didn't know Kenneth White, and whenever you talked about him in these meetings, and I'm going to reference the first meeting where I heard about Geopoetics, which you, David, led. You were at the Toronto International Festival of Storytelling, and you brought a good subject up about how cultures exchange and complement each other. And I think now in the internet era, we're seeing a lot of that. But before we had the World Wide Web, somehow people that had something they needed to say to each other found each other, and maybe they didn't do it face to face. Maybe there was a cultural drift. But yeah, this whole idea that cultures complement each other made a lot of sense to me. Thanks for saying that.
Thank you. Martina.
Sorry, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, now it works, thankfully. Yeah, I forget actually how I happened to find On the Atlantic Edge must have been around the year 2000, and just fell in love with that book. And I was in London a few years later on a fellowship and got wind of the fact that Kenneth White was going to read poetry and give a lecture at Aberdeen University. So I took a bus up to Aberdeen and was thrilled to, hear him speak and hear him recite his poetry, and started a correspondence with him then, and actually have some messages or exchanges until the year 22. And I, became more, obviously I was shy doing that, but I became more comfortable when he told me that he actually liked my book, and we started a conversation about Nietzsche, on whom he had written, and Ezra Pound, who was, a focus of my research, but not very much greeted in academic circles, much less in the US. so a lot about etymology. I once said the combination for me of etymological precision, it kind of jives with what was just said about punctuation and graphic precision. And at the same time, constantly this very spirited free association was something that just drew me in to the point of not being able to let go. So I'm in awe of Kenneth White's writing, and I'm very sad. I actually did not know until this event was announced that he had passed away in August already. So I really appreciate this event, and also wanted to say that I gave a talk on Nietzsche, Pound, and Kenneth White at the International Ezra Pound Conference in Edinburgh last July on the art of walking and grounding. So this will have to go on in his present absence, I'd like to say, and I thank you for organizing this.
Thanks, Martina. Yeah, Kathy Galloway, he wasn't always complimentary about theology, but had a great admiration for the old Celtic monks and medieval scholars like Duns Scotus as well. So it'd be interesting. Kathy, do you want to come in?
I'm not sure that I'm always very complimentary about theology either. But actually, what I most liked about Kenneth White, I met him in Glasgow Botanic Gardens, I think about 20 years ago, when he spoke there. And I think it was when Jerry Luce was the writer in residence at Glasgow Botanics. But I'd known his poetry before then, because I'd read a couple of poems in a New Writing Scotland. I think it was New Writing Scotland, way before then. And I couldn't believe them, actually, because they, it's not that they spoke to me intellectually, but they really put me in a place in a way that nobody else's poetry ever has. Actually, he has such a dense, strong sense of the there-ness of the place, is the best way I can put it. And it for me, it moves beyond culture. And that's why I love that thing about the skull and the mind, because it takes it out of mind and into, it's very good at putting us in our place as human beings, just putting us in our place alongside the gulls and the, and the rocks and everything else. And I can't, I'm so grateful for the phenomenal range of his poetry. And so sad that there won't be more. But I just am here really with an enormously strong sense of gratitude for his writing, and gratitude for all the people that keep interest and awareness of it alive, which I try to do in my small theological ways.
Thank you. Thanks. Just on that, but there being no more poetry, one of the kind of hopeful things is that there's a huge body of his work in French that is still to be translated into English. So, there is more to come, which we can all look forward to. Alistair Duncan, you've got your mic off, Luke, as if you're
I just thought I'm not in Scotland, and I'm not a poet. I just thought I'd just chip in a little something. I pulled off. I came across Kenneth White later than I thought I did, actually. I was in Dublin with my family many years ago. I reckon it must have been 2003. And I escaped them for a while and scurried into a bookshop and acquired this book, interestingly, The Book of Creation, The Practice of Celtic Spirituality, by a guy called J. Philip Newell. I remember nothing about this book at all, except that right the way through, the guy continually quoted Kenneth White, poem after poem, phrase after phrase. And also on the front cover, there's a accolade from David Abraham as well, who's a guy who's come to influence me. But I found it fascinating. From that book on Celtic Christianity, you mentioned White had little time, perhaps, for some aspects of Christianity. That was that book that led me into him. And then I got wandering his charts, and I probably read an awful lot of his works. And one of the things that his influence for me was, I was just looking at the website, the Geopoetics website. Alongside the language and the culture, there is also this whole side about, it says, developing our knowledge, but also using our senses to be attuned to the world. And there's this phrase about deconditioning ourselves by working on the body mind. And for me, that has been my journey, influenced massively by Kenneth White in the early days, is about how can we work with our own bodies and how can we engage with the land to allow things to show up for us. So for my own journey, the first thing I did after reading him and David Abraham was actually to do a master's in philosophy and study Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, people like that. But my practical outworking of my engagement with Kenneth White has very much been on this body, mind, senses, sensuality, connection with the land. I'm one of these people who moves on. So I would say now I don't read Kenneth White very much at all, but every time I do, or even when some of you have quoted things about him, I kind of find where I've gone to, he was already there if I'd only heard it in him. My own journey, I find myself going back to him and discovering, oh, bloody hell, he went there as well, and he latched onto that as well. So I found him a remarkable man and a remarkable influence on my own life, even though I never got to meet him or hear him or anything like that. But yes, it's a big loss.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Alistair.
Could I ask Dave, Glenda, you're making the film for us of Expressing the Earth about geopoetics. And did you not mention Philip Newell? You had filmed something recently related to him. Have I got that wrong? You need to unmute yourself, please.
Can you hear me there?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was quite sort of coincidentally the year before I got in touch with you. I had actually gone to Iona with John Philip Newell and got asked to go and film a series of lectures in Iona. And the final lecture was about Kenneth White, who I had never really heard of until I read his book. And when I was reading his book about Kenneth White, that's when I sort of heard the thing about geopoetics. And I was thinking, I'm sure I heard about geopoetics. And so that was the connection to me making the film. I got an email from Geopoetics, and there was a talk the following week about Kenneth White. And I saw the crowdfunder thing, and I was like, it'd be nice to get in touch. So yeah, but so I've worked quite a bit with John Philip Newell and his latest book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. It's got different chapters, but there's a whole chapter about Kenneth White in that as well. But,
wow.
Yes, it's quite a parallel there with the last film project. But yeah, for me, just it's sort of coincidentally got involved with the project. But over this year, I've just become so immersed in Kenneth White's work. I've read so much, and I was would hope to go over to France to meet with him and interview him. And so it was a real blow when we heard that wasn't going to be possible. I'm really sad not to have met him, but we have got some really beautiful stuff. We found some lovely archive stuff, and we're really hoping that the film can be a real beautiful legacy to his life and geopoetics. So, yeah.
Thanks, Glenda. Corinne, you have a foot in France and in Scotland. I wonder if you had any comments.
I am a novice in terms of getting to discover Kenneth White, and I still have like everything to discover basically. But when he passed away, Norman posted something on Facebook which linked to a little film. I think it was a tribute, and it was like to do with his sorry for being so ignorant, his glass book. And everything about this film, just like particularly obviously his poetry and what he was expressing, just like really touched me deeply. And I remember at the end of the film I was just in tears, and I guess it's maybe because, like, even on paper, although nothing about it is paper, I am French, but I've lived in Scotland for very long. I sort of am a linguist, I'm a translator, and I also am a yoga and meditation teacher, and I love arts. So, I mean, everything that kind of, sort of, has resonated with me from that film, and obviously from, I guess, will do when I get to discover more from his work, because like there's like the language aspect, the connection between mind, body, and nature, which is like omnipresent in yoga and all the philosophies associated. It's just about like assimilation of nature in the body and all the senses, and then I guess in his case the expression in a beautiful way of it. So yes, really that's all I can say. But yeah, I'm very glad to have attended this event at the last minute. Find it very interesting, and thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Can I just add that the film, Perrine, that you're referring to is called Les Cygnes Sauvages, The Wild Swans, and it's about 14 minutes long, and it's a beautiful short film about the making of that book. It's in a limited edition, and what's interesting to me particularly is Marie-Claude is in it as well as Kenneth, and there's at one point where when we went to Hamilton Drive after the jargon group late night, at one point he showed us into his writing room, and on the floor and on the desk there were little piles of paper. He was doing all his work in handwritten, and on top of them were these different stones holding them down. And that film, which I think was only made a year or two ago, he said it shows him in his Atlantic studio, as he called it, and he says he does a little dance between all the piles of papers in this room that are held down by stones, and it just took a trick with me, the idea of him going in the morning to start some more writing, and he was dancing between the papers that he'd already started writing on.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Anybody else want to come in? Mary, do you want to say something rather than?
Okay, yeah, no, I just wasn't sure if everything was going to end, and I thought I'd add that comment. But yeah, no, I'm a visual artist, so I just wanted to come at it from that angle. And as I've said, yeah, it was a tutor at art college in the 80s that shared a pamphlet with me. I think it was the Bird Path or something, but I basically filed it away, and it wasn't till sort of around 2009. I come from the Outer Hebrides. I'm back here, and perhaps what started in 2009 has kind of led me here. But it was really exploring that link to place and that experiential sort of dislocation or loss, but something that you carry with you. So it was that collection of open worlds that I had at the time, which just gave me a way in. So I was seeking a kind of visual language in my painting to express that connection to nature and place and identity. And I can't really explain quite how his work did it, but it just all kind of came together. And yeah, it just kind of made sense, just the sort of theory underpinning it, as well as the specific poems relating to here, to Scalpe, where I grew up, and Harris. So yeah, just wanted to
Of
say
course,
that.
that is the locus for it's probably his most famous poem. Would people say High Blue Day in Scalpe? It's maybe his best known.
Which is kind of lovely, because I mean, like I say, that's where I grew up, and if it wasn't howling wind and rain, I could see just the Cuddy Point in Scalpe from here. But yeah, and I think also that interesting kind of I see that Mark's put his hand up. I'm really interested in abstract musical composition as well, and there was just a lot of things around that, the kind of annotation of grids and maps, and the analytical, combined with the expressive, that made sense to me.
Thank you. So it's the low grade day in Scalpe today.
It's pretty low grade. Marky day.
I think what we will start to wind up now, and I was actually going to go to Mark next anyway, just and invite, just in a sort of bookend, invite Mark and Nori just to possibly wrap up the session, which we have to finish in about 10 minutes. So, Mark.
Yeah, no, it's quite an honour to be able to talk and like this, and with colleagues and friends, new friends. I think what's really interesting as I listen to the commentaries, Mary there, for instance, and her friends in there, is Kenneth gave permission to people to think differently. That is the art of a great teacher, a great pedagogist, to allow you to think differently. And to explore things differently. He used language to deliberately provoke people to think differently. I'd mentioned the titles of his books. He could also be quite acerbic, and he would be quite shocking in his language sometimes. And there's that, but there's also a few people have mentioned the fact that he's done that. He's been there. Oh, I see, and it opens up all sorts of windows and doors of your own personal life and experience that Kenneth's touched before, in his way. And that's really beautiful. So the permissions are really what his legacy is embodied in all of us, and I think it's beautiful. Thanks, Dave.
Yes. And I think one of the things that always struck me was how he was able to sort of sit lightly with his intellectual exploration. So, he went quite deeply into Zen Buddhism, but he never became a Buddhist. Same with shamanism. He never became a shaman, and I think kind of counseled against people jumping into these things too deeply. Nori, do you want to wrap up by somebody was asking what the name of the film was? It's Les Cygnes Sauvages, the Wild Swans. Do you want to say a wee bit about the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics and any other concluding remarks that may occur to you?
Before I forget, we are having an actual live event in conjunction and collaboration with Ramona Fortiad at the Department of Modern Languages at University of Glasgow. And this will be a one-day event, and it will be on Friday, the 17th of November, if you could make a wee note of that. But you'll get a mailing about that when I follow this up with as I said in the chat, I'll include Regis's paper that he sent me very helpfully along with the video. So that will come to you, as will the chat itself. So if you want to be immortalized in the chat, you better be quick. That's one of the things. That event will have a range of speakers. It won't be none of us will be paid for it, I have to hasten to say, but it will be a celebration of Kenneth White's life and work. And it was Ramona who put together the 2018 visit by Kenneth to Glasgow, and we think it since his first degree was was from Glasgow University, and he was also given an honorary degree. We think it's appropriate that that should be the venue for this one-day conference, if you like, about Kenneth and his work. I just want to add a couple of things that I picked up in the discussion. The changing of his words in his from mind to skull. Actually, there's a whole lot of changes in lots of his different versions of his books. This is something that Cairns Craig, who is the editing the collected works of Kenneth White from the University of Edinburgh Press, and he said to me, he thought it'd be an easy number because they would just be the same. 3 books would be put together in volume 1 and another 3 in volume 2. But Kenneth insisted on changes to them, quite significant, quite a lot of changes. So I think that's been pretty typical. I also found that, and this was something that Tony, and I've mentioned this in a book I'm hoping to bring out next year called Living on an Island, Expressing the Earth. Tony and I had this chat, Tony McManus and I had this chat about the book about, with money, Gunny Moberg, about Orkney, and it was in French. And we said, was that the same trip we were on? Because we were all there, but none of us got a mention in the book. And then I found that when you look at across the territories, where the first chapter is Islands of the Ork or something, and again, it's different again. And over the breakfast table, there were these guys who were originally from Glasgow, who were in the French edition, but in the English edition, they were from Birmingham. So, so I think he was quite good at finessing his work at a later date, as many writers do. The other point I wanted to make was that I think it's in Tony's book, The Radical Field, or Coast to Coast. Ken makes the point that he's this great opportunity that we have living at this time, that we have access to all the cultures of the world, and that fits in with what people were saying earlier about different cultures complementing each other. So in a way, he was, I suppose, like a jackdaw. He was picking out from different, especially Eastern thinking, things and working them into his poetry, his essays, and his waybooks. And it is a great opportunity that we have, that we can access so much online these days. So I think he made that very strong point. And these are just 2 things that I picked up from the discussion. But I've really enjoyed the fact that so many of you have warm memories of him, and that you've shared them with us tonight. I feel that's very important. And we will be, basically, the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics is thriving. If you haven't joined yet, please do. It's only a tenner a year, and you get a free book, Grounding a World, Essays on the Work of Kenneth White. And there's lots more to come. And thank you for your donations, which will, once Eventbrite has taken its cut, small cut, that those donations will all go to a Kenneth White bursary to try to develop geopoetics by inviting someone to come and live and work here for, say, a week at the new building we have, the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics, just next door to where I live on Isle of Ling. So thank you so much for all those generous donations. It's much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, Nori, and thanks to everybody for coming along tonight, and to those of you who contributed. Favorite word of Kenneth White's is archipelago. So it was a kind of archipelago of impressions. It was very nice to hop from one to the other, and we'll hopefully see you all at the next online event. I know people are based far and wide and not all able to come next month, but we hope to see a few of you next month and lots of you online at future events. So thank you all very much, and a very good evening to you. Thank you.
Nori, can I thank you for something other? You when I gave the talk on voice, I don't remember when you recommended that I go meet Richard DeMarco, and I wanted to tell you that I finally succeeded last summer to spend many hours with Richard DeMarco. So
wow.
thank you for that advice. It took me years to bring it to turn it into reality, but it did happen.
Okay, I'll not say any more about Richard DeMarco.
Yeah, but and can you at some point answer me about the film?
Yeah, I've started. Yeah,
I'd really like to know.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've written you a very short reply, but
yeah, no, not now here. I just mean in general. By no means
yeah.
it needs to be here or now. Yeah, yeah,
No,
yeah.
but I will follow that up next week. We've got a work
Super.
on Sunday that I have to prepare for, but I will write back to you about that very much. And Glenda, I'll invite to
Will be the
as well. Yeah, we work
Super.
on it together, really. But
Thank you so much for doing this. It was beautiful.
lovely. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Lovely
Yeah. Bye for now.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye for now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.